Before the world fought over borders, before promises turned into possession, and before conquest demanded justification, there was a line, drawn not by generals or kings, but by ancestry. Genesis 10:19, a verse that does not roar, it barely whispers. And the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as you go toward Gerar, as far as Gaza. In that one sentence, a geography is named before it becomes narrative. Gaza, not as battleground, not as prophecy, simply as boundary, as breath, as belonging. This verse appears in the lineage of Noah, his sons, their sons, and the settlements they formed as they spread across a post-flood world, still drying under the weight of divine reset. Among them, Ham, then Canaan. Names not yet stained by judgment, only outlined by geography. Canaan did not march into this land. He inherited it by descent, by direction, by quiet settlement. The Bible gives us no story of conquest here, only a cartography of belonging. Sidon, Gerar, Gaza, coordinates of presence, not yet of tension. This territory, placed subtly into Scripture's earliest maps, held no prophecy, no altar, no curse. Only footsteps, the kind that mark soil before blood does. And in those footsteps, we find a different kind of narrative, not of heroes and empires, but of names and neighbors. Before this land became a headline, it was a lineage, a stretch of earth remembered not for what was taken from it, but for what was first entrusted to it. It is easy to forget that this was the world's beginning, that when Noah's sons descended from the ark, they scattered, not randomly, but rooted. Every name listed in Genesis 10 echoes a decision to settle, to build, to claim, but not to fight. Not yet. There was no Israel, no Abraham, no Mosaic law, no Davidic throne, only names that would one day be remembered or erased. Canaans were remembered because of what would come, not what had yet happened. In this, there is a sacred stillness, a hush between divine breaths, a map drawn by hands that did not yet know of chosen people or promised lands. This was not land waiting to be conquered, it was land already lived. And perhaps the weight of that is heavier than we imagine, because Scripture, in its divine wisdom, does not begin the conversation of Gaza with warning or judgment. It begins it with acknowledgement. It was there. People were there. Long before the divine promises pointed to that soil, a border, a name, a people, a silence. He was not the chosen son. He did not build altars. He did not walk with God as his father once had. Yet from him came cities, borders, and names that still whisper through the corridors of Scripture. Ham, son of Noah, bearer of an ambiguous legacy. And from Ham, Canaan, a name that would become more geography than genealogy, more map than man. The Bible does not linger on Canaan's deeds because it barely gives him any. His story is not action, it is inheritance. His name enters the biblical record almost silently, yet it becomes one of the most echoing presences in all the land. Canaan's portion, detailed in Genesis 10, unfolds like a cartographer's list. Cities, territories, from Sidon to Gerar, to the edge of what would be remembered centuries later as a land of promise. But for Canaan, it was not promise. It was portion, received, not requested, inhabited, not claimed. He did not fight for it, nor was he sent there by divine decree. He simply was, planted into the soil as a branch from a larger tree, growing in a direction that history would one day question. This territory bore no prophetic shadow when Canaan's descendants laid their stones. They were not warned, nor were they anointed. And yet, what they built stood. What they named endured. And that endurance, that silent continuity, says something often overlooked. Not all that exists in the biblical world is born from calling. Some exist from continuity. Some from survival. Some from the quiet, unchosen flow of time. Canaan becomes the name of a people who were not covenant bearers, but still carriers of memory. Their presence on the land is not framed as rebellion, it is framed as fact. They lived, they multiplied, they settled, they built, And God saw it. God allowed it. God, in his silence, gave space before he gave promise. There is a sacred restraint in the way Scripture handles this origin. It does not rush to explain. It does not erase Canaan in favor of what will later be Israel. It places him first. It gives him territory. It names his cities. And it allows us to witness a map before it becomes a mission. The legacy of Ham through Canaan is not marked by spiritual greatness, but it is marked by existence. And in a world where so much is defined by divine favor, there is something profoundly human about being remembered simply because you were there. Before any covenant echoed across deserts, before altars were built or commandments inscribed, the land already held stories. It bore names. It cradled generations. It waited, not in silence, but in saturation. Because even before divine words marked its soil, that soil had been walked, worked, and worn by feet that knew only inheritance, not calling. This was the land of Canaan. It did not begin holy, it began human. Genesis 10 does not elevate this land as sacred, it presents it as settled. Not a prize, not a vision, but a reality. It describes a stretch that included coasts and hills, cities and plains. A mosaic of presence before the mosaic of promise. And it is this distinction that carries weight. For in our hunger to find destiny, we often forget that geography precedes theology, that someone was there first. That breath filled those valleys before prophecy did. The sons of Canaan did not know they were treading on future tension. Their hands were not constructing temples, they were building homes. Not because God had spoken, but because the earth yielded. Vineyards grew, walls rose, markets bustled. A civilization took shape, not because it was foretold, but because it was lived. And in this quiet formation, there is dignity, there is continuity. Scripture, in its brilliance, does not erase this. It includes it. It names the cities. It respects the chronology. Because divine narrative never overrides human narrative, it enters into it. It does not dismiss what came before the promise. It acknowledges it and then moves through it. When Abram would one day walk this land, he would not be stepping into a wilderness. He would be stepping into inheritance, just not his own. And that moment would be more complex than a simple act of obedience. It would be a silent collision between what was given and what would be claimed. A meeting of footsteps, one carrying memory, the other carrying promise. But in Genesis 10, that meeting has not happened. There is only space. There is only life. There is only a land that existed before being renamed. And that fact alone gives this chapter its power, because it tells us the story of God's movement never begins in a vacuum. It begins on paths already walked, among people already settled, in places already called home. To remember that is to honor the full shape of the biblical narrative, not just the divine interventions, but the human rhythms that preceded them. The promise is coming, but first the land must speak. And here in Genesis 10 it does, without thunder, without fire, but with presence. Canaan did not choose his legacy. He did not carve his name into scrolls, nor demand remembrance. His presence in the biblical narrative is quiet, almost reluctant, a son listed, a boundary drawn, a curse inherited. But from this silence emerges a weight that words alone could never carry, the inheritance of a land without the blessing that defines it. He was the grandson of a man who watched the world drown. Noah saw mountains vanish and emerge again. He planted, he prophesied, he cursed. And Canaan, his descendant, bore the fallout of that curse not in his body, but in his geography. He was not exiled. He was settled, not blessed, yet not banished. His fate lived in tension. He belonged to the soil, but not to the promise. The Bible does not give him a voice. His name echoes through territories and lineages, but never through lament or testimony. And still, his legacy is everywhere. Cities that would one day tremble at the sound of trumpets first rose under his son's hands. Lands that would one day be promised to another were his, quietly, completely. To inherit without a future is a peculiar burden. There is work, but no covenant. There is history, but no prophecy. Canaan's line laid bricks, planted trees, sang songs, lived lives, and yet in Scripture's long shadow, their existence is often read backwards, from conquest, from conflict, from divine promise. But Genesis 10 insists otherwise. It places them not in opposition, but in origin. This is not a story of sin. It is a story of chronology. The Canaanites were not erased by God's plan. They were present before it was announced, and that complicates the neat borders of sacred and profane. Because if the land was already inhabited, then the question arises, what does divine purpose look like when it intersects with human dwelling? Can holiness share space with heritage? Canaan's inheritance may not have come wrapped in calling, but it came with consequence. His descendants shaped landscapes that would one day echo with other names: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But before those footsteps arrived, theirs had already left trails in the dust. They named hills, dug wells, stood beneath the same stars that Abraham would one day count. To carry land without a blessing is to carry it raw. It is to know the rhythm of rain, not the rhythm of heaven. It is to plant, not in hope, but in habit. Yet even this Scripture does not discard. It records it, it respects it, because every divine beginning arrives in the midst of something already unfolding. There is something sacred about a land not yet spoken for. A territory outlined in Scripture without commentary, judgment, or vision. Just names, just places, just presence. Genesis 10:19 draws a boundary not to prepare for war or promise, but to acknowledge what already is. From Sidon to Gerar, as far as Gaza, each point marks not a conquest, but a condition. People live here. They belong here. Not because God said they would, but because life said they did. This is the quiet tension of Genesis, the presence of people before the presence of prophecy. We are accustomed to holy lands being empty fields, awaiting destiny. But the Bible doesn't begin with vacancy. It begins with fullness, with the map already occupied, with names already spoken. Before there is calling, there is coexistence. To live in this verse is to stand at a frontier, not of nations, but of narratives. This is the silence before Scripture speaks of covenant, before altars are built, before angels appear. It is the space where theology has not yet made its claim, where God's voice has not yet broken the horizon, and yet life is already unfolding. Children are born, crops are harvested, cities are raised, and the divine watches, not to erase, but to observe. This land is not neutral, it is remembered, and that memory is not stained by future battles. It is held intact by this moment, where the sons of Canaan walk the soil with no idea what is coming. They are not villains, they are not warnings. They are simply there, and the verse remembers them. When we read as far as Gaza, it is tempting to jump forward to the prophets, the judgments, the fall. But here, in Genesis 10, it is just distance, just geography, just inheritance. This borderline is not a warning, it is a witness. There is a humility in that, a spiritual restraint, because God does not always begin by speaking. Sometimes he begins by seeing. And perhaps that is why Genesis starts not with a declaration, but with a description. Before God gives land, he honors its existing names. Before he plants his people, he acknowledges those already rooted. What does it mean for divine story to enter a land that already breathes with other stories? Genesis 10 offers no answer, only space, only margin, only silence. And in that silence, we begin to hear the most sacred kind of tension. Not the clash between armies, but the question between boundaries. A question that will not be resolved in this chapter, nor in the next, but one that will hum beneath every footstep taken from this point forward. Centuries later, a man will walk into this land not by blood, but by calling. His name will be Abram. He will not arrive as a conqueror, but as a wanderer, led not by maps or inheritance, but by a voice. The voice will not describe the borders as they were. It will redraw them, not with ink, but with intention. To your descendants I will give this land, the voice will say in Genesis 12:7, a sentence that echoes over a geography already inhabited, a whisper that bends history. But this chapter is not yet his. This land is not yet promised, and therein lies the tension, the spiritual undertone that pulses beneath the soil. Because when Abram steps into Canaan, he steps onto ground that was already named, already worked, already loved. Every tree he sees, every stone he touches, every hill he crosses, they belong to someone else. The promise does not erase that presence. It enters into it. What does it mean to be told that something is yours when someone else already lives there? What happens when divine intent meets human reality? Scripture does not flinch from this discomfort. It lets it linger. It lets us feel the quiet friction between inheritance and habitation. Abram does not raise a sword. He builds an altar. He does not claim territory. He marks gratitude. In that gesture, we see a different kind of conquest, one not of domination, but of devotion. He does not remove the old names. He adds a new one, worship. That is the paradox of divine promise. It arrives without displacement, but it carries a future that will eventually shift everything. And so, Abram walks. He honors what is. He believes what will be. He dwells in a land that is his and not his, a holy contradiction. This tension is not political, it is spiritual. It is the awareness that God's plan often begins in the middle of someone else's story, that his calling never enters empty space. It always touches existing lives, histories, homes, and yet he calls. To revisit Genesis 10 with Genesis 12 in mind is to see the unfolding of a divine dilemma. How will God fulfill his promise without dishonoring what already is? How does heaven enter history without erasing it? Scripture does not rush this question. It allows it to breathe. And in that breath, we find the weight of faith, not just to believe in promise, but to carry it gently through another space. Canaan's land was not silent. It simply had no voice recorded. The people who lived there, the sons who built cities, the families who planted vineyards, they left no prayers in Scripture, no psalms of longing, no covenants carved in stone. Yet their absence in the text does not mean absence in the world. They were there, living, dreaming, dying. Their footsteps traced the same soil that later prophets would weep over. But the Bible in its silence makes a quiet point. Not every presence is preserved in verse. This is the ache of pre-promised lands. They exist, but they are not remembered. Their names are mentioned, but their hearts are not explored. Gerar, Sidon, Gaza, each one a place full of mothers and sons, festivals and fires, births and burials. But Scripture passes through them with only the briefest touch, like a traveler noting scenery from a moving chariot, because the story is not yet theirs, or perhaps because the story will one day replace them. There is something sacred in recognizing this silence, in pausing to wonder about the unnamed lives beneath the text, the artisans who shaped walls, the elders who settled disputes under fig trees, the children who ran through fields that would one day be called battlegrounds. These were not shadows, they were souls, and though the Bible does not pause for them, we can. Faith is not only about what is written, it is about what is remembered. And sometimes to remember is to honor, not by rewriting history, but by recognizing its weight. Canaan's descendants were not evil for being present. They were simply not chosen, and that lack of selection became their silence, but not their erasure. God's plan moved forward. The promise took shape, but the cost of promise is often unseen. The soil that supports destiny is often soaked in stories never told. And perhaps this, too, is part of the sacred narrative, the realization that divine paths walk over human stories, not above them, that some altars are built on foundations we did not lay. This is not to question the justice of God. It is to feel the humility of being included in a story that spans lives we will never know. And in that humility, a strange reverence grows, not just for the promise fulfilled, but for the lives passed by on the way. There is a mystery in Genesis 10:19 that refuses to be solved by theology. A border is drawn from Sidon to Gerar as far as Gaza, but there is no why, no command, no commentary, no divine voice explaining the reason for the line. God sees, but he does not speak. He traces a geography, but he withholds interpretation. And in that silence, a question forms, not about territory, but about trust. Why does God mark without message? Why map before mission? Why describe before declaring? These are not questions for conquest, they are questions for contemplation, because sometimes God moves not with declarations, but with descriptions. He does not always begin with fire or voice. Sometimes he begins with a line, quiet, uninterpreted, a preface, not a prophecy. This is what makes Genesis 10:19 so unsettling for those who crave certainty. It does not explain, it merely exists. It does not point, it only places. It does not demand faith, it invites wonder, and maybe that is its purpose, to teach us that not every movement of God comes with clarity, that some of his first actions are whispers, not shouts, and that reverence begins not when we understand, but when we observe. The lands mentioned, Sidon, Gerar, Gaza, are not chosen. They are not cursed. They are simply marked. And in being marked, they become sacred, not by virtue of blessing, but by virtue of being seen. Because there is something holy in being noticed by God, even if not yet called by him. This is where faith deepens, in the waiting between being mapped and being named, in the space between presence and purpose, in the stillness where geography waits for theology. And those who dwell in such places, those who live before the voice, are not forgotten. They are first. Before a land can be promised, it must be acknowledged. Before it can be transformed, it must be traced. Before it can be claimed, it must be seen. And Genesis 10:19 is God seeing, not acting, not choosing, not judging, just seeing. And if that is how his story begins, with observation instead of intervention, then maybe we too are invited to pause, to see before we speak, to trace before we take, to listen before we proclaim, because not every border needs a banner. Some need only a breath. Every stone in that land carried a story, long before a single promise was spoken. The soil between Sidon and Gerar was not waiting to be made holy. It was already ancient, already marked by footsteps of fathers who bore no covenant, only memory. Memory of waters that once covered the earth, memory of survival, of scattering, of sons finding their place in a world that began again. The sons of Canaan did not walk under prophecy, they walked under sky. Their days were not shaped by sacred law, but by the rhythm of seasons, the language of the land, the need to belong somewhere, and yet, by simply settling, they shaped the future, not with vision, but with presence, not with faith, but with roots. What does it mean to live in a land before it becomes significant? To build cities on ground that will later be called contested? To raise children in valleys that will one day be named in prayers or in wars? It means to exist before interpretation, to belong before theology, to hold a place in the unfolding of history, not as a chosen people, but as the people already there, the ones whose stories are rarely told, yet whose homes became the canvas upon which divine stories were later painted. Canaan's lineage filled the land with names, cities that would echo through generations, not because of what they believed, but because of where they stood. Places that would one day be judged not for their origins, but for what others would become in their midst. And still, the memory of what came before lingers beneath the text, a subtle thread that refuses to be cut. Because God's story does not begin with Abraham. It begins with those who simply were, with Noah's grandsons, with builders, not prophets, with roots, not revelations. To remember the land is to remember its first witnesses. To honor the soil is to honor its first footprints. Even if the text does not linger on their names, the land does. The stones remember, the rivers recall, the winds have heard their voices, and maybe that's the quiet holiness of Genesis 10:19. It doesn't tell us to conquer, it tells us to remember, to know that before the sacred journey begins, there were those who stayed, who settled, who lived. There are moments in Scripture where heaven is silent, not absent, but observing. Genesis 10:19 exists in that silence. It is not a command. It is not a judgment. It is not a calling. It is a line drawn quietly across a post-flood world, as if God were watching where men would go before saying where he would send. This is the stillness between flood and promise, between survival and selection. The land described here is not yet divided by covenant. It is only divided by descendants. And that division is not warlike, it is organic. Families settle, tribes spread. Borders emerge not from conflict, but from kinship. But in that divine silence, there is weight, a hush that precedes the thunder of calling, because soon, just 2 chapters later, God will speak again. He will call Abram. He will point toward lands already settled, lands like Sidon, like Gerar, like Gaza. And with that calling, a sacred tension will begin. How does God speak promise over places already occupied? How does heaven bless a geography that already holds names, homes, and memories? Perhaps the answer begins in this quiet chapter. Genesis 10 does not prepare us for conquest. It prepares us to reckon with presence, to recognize that divine plans often unfold upon lands already loved, that before a place becomes holy, it is human. Before it is called destiny, it is called home. The silence of God here is not indifference, it is recognition, a pause before pronouncement, a sacred restraint that sees before it speaks. And maybe this is where the spiritual tension begins, not with prophecy, but with presence. Not with the chosen, but with those already there. The sons of Canaan did not ask to be part of a divine narrative, but they are. Because every inch of land God will later promise was once walked by those he did not call. To read Genesis 10:19 is to be invited into this mystery, a verse that whispers rather than declares, a geography that waits beneath the surface of theology, a stillness that precedes the storm of significance. And perhaps this is what sacred history always does. It honors those who came first, even if they are not the ones who stay last. It records them, not for glory, but for grounding, because no promise truly begins without first acknowledging the dust it will rest upon. Before a prophet speaks, there is a pause. Before a covenant is offered, there is a path. Genesis 10:19 is that path. It does not proclaim, it maps. It draws a boundary not of ideology, but of inheritance. And that boundary, stretching from Sidon to Gerar and down to Gaza, becomes the canvas on which God will later paint his promises. But the canvas was not blank. It held stories, it held footsteps, it held names like Canaan, whose lineage carved homes into soil long before Abram ever lifted his eyes to count stars. The narrative does not rush to erase these names. It preserves them. It honors their position in time, if not in covenant. And this honoring is not accidental. It is theological. Because the promise to come is not made in a vacuum. It enters a world already full of borders and memories. God does not begin with conquest. He begins with observation. He acknowledges the world as it is, before he shapes it into what it will become. This border, from Sidon to Gaza, is not drawn in battle. It is drawn in ancestry, a quiet tracing of where Canaan's descendants took root. And in this tracing, we find one of Scripture's most profound tensions, the collision of presence and promise. The people here were not rebels, they were residents. They did not defy God, they simply preceded his plan. And in that timing, there is a mystery. Why does God allow some to build what others will inherit? Why does he delay his voice until the ground is already claimed? Perhaps because every sacred story must wrestle with displacement, with the reality that promises often arrive late, not in time to prevent pain, but in time to redeem it. And that redemption begins not with declaration, but with remembrance. Genesis 10:19 remembers. It names those who were there, not to exalt them, but to ensure they are not forgotten, so that when the promise comes, it does not erase, it transforms. It does not deny what came before, it fulfills what was always unfolding. And the voice that will soon call Abram does not silence these early settlers. It speaks into their geography. It begins its sacred mission not by denying the past, but by stepping into it. When the voice of God finally broke through the silence, it did not fall on empty soil. It found Abram in the land that others had already named, already lived, already loved. To your descendants I will give this land, said the voice in Genesis 12:7. But the land had dwellers, the hills had echoes, the valleys had memories. The soil was not waiting to be owned, it was already spoken for. This is where the spiritual tension thickens. The land was not unclaimed, it was unpromised, and that distinction changes everything. For what does it mean when God's promises arrive, where lives have already begun? When his sacred calling lands on spaces with histories, with hearths, with heartbeats? Abram does not question it. He builds an altar, not as a monument to conquest, but as a response to presence. A way of saying, I see what's here, I hear the silence beneath the soil, and I will not pretend this begins with me, because it doesn't. The biblical narrative is honest about this complexity. It names the Canaanites still in the land. It does not sanitize the tension between promise and presence. Instead, it allows them to overlap, to share space, to challenge simplistic readings of destiny. Because the promise was divine, but the ground was human. And in that intersection, the full weight of Scripture's complexity is felt. Abram's faith was not blind ambition. It was a walk into tension, a journey into landscapes where someone else had already planted trees. His belief was not in divine displacement, but in divine timing, that somehow this promise would unfold without erasing the dignity of what was already there. This is the thread that runs from Genesis 10 to Genesis 12, the acknowledgement that God's work always begins in the middle of someone else's story, and that holiness does not require emptiness, it requires reverence. To read this is to realize that perhaps the land itself remembers all its names, the Canaanite names, the patriarchal names, the prophetic names, and maybe in its sacred soil none are fully lost. They become layers, they become echoes, they become the quiet reminders that God's promises are never clean slates, they are continuations. There are places in the world that seem to listen, not because they have ears, but because they hold echoes. The land between Sidon, Gerar, and what Scripture calls Gaza. This stretch of earth seems to absorb stories, carry footsteps, cradle tears. It does not speak, but it remembers. And in remembering, it participates. This land heard the laughter of children before it heard the voice of prophets. It held tents before it bore altars. It knew the quiet rhythms of herders, the silent labor of hands building without blueprints, carving out life with no audience. Before it was declared sacred, it was simply inhabited, and that memory lingers. The Bible, in its honesty, never deletes the presence of those who came first. It does not demand amnesia to introduce promise. Instead, it layers history, each name, each tribe, each border, like a palimpsest. And perhaps the ground itself is the only one who understands the full story. Because long before Israel crossed its boundaries, long before judgments were proclaimed or temples were built, this land bore witness to lives unsung, to lineages left in footnotes, to people who never saw their names etched in covenant, yet shaped the soil nonetheless. The land carries it all, promise and presence, silence and song, blessing and absence. This is not a story of conquest. It is a story of continuity. of a terrain that bears the fingerprints of many before it becomes holy to one. And in that layering, we find something sacred, a reminder that God is not the God of blank pages, but of ongoing texts. He writes over stories, but never with erasure, only with depth. Perhaps this is why the land matters so much in Scripture, because it listens. It remembers who lived there before the calling came. It does not forget the weight of steps that fell before altars were raised. And in that memory, the earth becomes a witness, not to battles, but to becoming. Some lands demand action, others demand silence. But the land described in Genesis 10:19 does something subtler. It teaches waiting. Before any prophecy, before any exile or return, that territory simply existed. It was lived in, walked on, known. And in its quiet presence, it became a teacher, not of war or worship, but of patience. This stretch of soil, mentioned in passing, holds more than cities or borders. It holds time. It waited centuries before its name was spoken in promise. It absorbed generations before being drawn into covenant. It stood still while heaven prepared its next sentence. And in that stillness, it teaches us something. Divine timing never erases what came before. It transforms it. Every covenant begins in silence. Every promise finds roots in land that seemed ordinary. Gaza, Gerar, Sidon, these names were not chosen because they were empty, but because they were already full of life, full of memory, full of human stories too easily lost in sacred scripts. Yet God does not overwrite them. He begins there. There is a spiritual rhythm in Scripture that mirrors the rhythm of the land. Sow, wait, reap. But often, we want the harvest before the stillness. We crave the promise without the process. Yet the geography of Genesis 10 shows us otherwise. Before calling Abram, God outlines the map. Before he speaks inheritance, he acknowledges inheritance already in place. And perhaps the land itself is the parable. It endures. It holds its memory without demanding vindication. It offers no resistance to the divine narrative, yet it does not vanish beneath it. It remains layered, sacred, scarred, not because it is perfect, but because it has waited well. Sometimes the most spiritual thing we can do is wait like the land, to remain faithful in silence, to honor what came before while preparing for what comes next. Because in Scripture, geography is never incidental. It is often the first vessel of grace. His name appears again, Gaza, quietly, like it did the first time. No trumpets, no judgments, only presence. A repetition, not for emphasis, but for closure. The verse that once marked a boundary now marks a memory. A beginning once overlooked becomes an ending that lingers. We end where we began, at the edge of a map, on soil drawn into story by the simplest act of naming. No prophecy has yet unfolded. No blood has been spilled. No kings have ruled. And yet, the place has spoken. Not through events, but through endurance. What makes a place sacred? Is it the miracles performed there, the battles fought, the temples raised, or is it something earlier, something quieter? Perhaps sacredness begins when a place is seen, when it is named, when it is known not for what it will become, but for what it already is. Gaza, in Genesis 10:19, is not a symbol of conflict. It is a symbol of recognition. A place recorded not because it would one day be disputed, but because it was simply real. In the divine record, being seen is sacred. Being known even in silence is holy. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson from this ancient mention. That long before theology shaped it, before nations claimed it, before sorrow soaked its soil, Gaza was known. It belonged. It was home. And God, in his vast narrative, paused to draw its name. We often seek meaning in action, in drama, in divine intervention. But sometimes the meaning is in the margins, in the verses that don't shout, in the cities that aren't yet blessed or cursed, in the names whispered into Scripture before they meant anything to history. To end with Gaza is not to return to the news. It is to return to the roots, to the idea that every story has a soil, that every covenant begins on land already walked, that God, in crafting redemption, does not erase origin, he fulfills it. So let the name rest here once more, not as a headline, not as a prophecy, but as it was in the beginning, a point on a map, a part of a people, a pulse in the earth, Gaza.